Well, hello everyone. I wanted to put together a little lecture to add to the chapter on self. One of the things I think this chapter can use, and some of this has been repeated from earlier chapters, but I still think it important, is some of the different theories behind how children and even teenagers develop a sense of self and self identification. So really, I've only got just a couple theories here, but I definitely think they are important. So let's get started. First of all, if we're going to talk about theories of self, we have to start with someone we've mentioned before or has been mentioned before. Hopefully, you've heard of Erik Erikson. Erikson was actually not a student of Freud directly. He was a student of Anna Freud, and Anna Freud was the daughter of Sigmund Freud. He actually passed away about 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, 1994. So, in a sense, to someone as old as me, this was a gentleman that did not necessarily live 500 years ago. And his theory is still very important to people today. According to Erikson, all right, he believes that identity actually comes from unconscious forces. Now, this is very, very similar to what Freud said. Freud believed primarily in unconscious forces as being the driving force behind who we are. But he actually took it a little bit farther and he came up with the belief that it was a combination of that internal unconscious force and society, okay, a social influence. So I define this slightly different than how sometimes the books get a little over the top about this, but I think I know I hit the material correctly in the way that it is pronounced or the way it is explained. What we're referring to here is Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory, as opposed to the psychosexual theories of Sigmund Freud, which I'm not going to get into because I don't think they're a good indicator of self in the 21st century. Right? Now, according to Erik Erikson, um, your personality actually begins to develop at birth. Okay, that is actually very similar to the concept of Sigmund Freud. And when it comes to personality, Erikson believed that you are actually going through stages of personality development throughout your entire life. Whereas Freud, if you pay attention to him, he believed you hit your fifth and final stage uh, by the time you were in adolescence. So, as far as personality development goes in relation to the unconscious, Freud would tell you that by the time you hit your teenage years, you're done. Erikson disagreed. In fact, he believed that each of these stages is something of a crisis that has to be overcome. And it truly is a combination of unconscious forces dealing with societal influences. And that's why we call it the psychosocial stages of development. Now, I'm only going to go through the first four stages because, or a little bit more, five stages. The last three deal with adulthood, and obviously this is child psych. So let's begin. According to Erik Erikson, the very first stage starts at birth and runs to about age 1.5. I've heard some people stop it at one. Some writers of this theory says it runs till 2 or 3. I'm not going to debate that. I'm just going to say from birth to age 1.5. All right. And I don't believe I'm too terribly different from the textbook. There won't be any test questions or quiz questions, or final exam questions where I say one thing and the book changes it by 3 months or 6 months or whatever. You won't see that. Trust versus mistrust. According to Erikson's theory, infants a lot of times are born with absolutely no ability to take care of themselves. Unlike other mammals, we cannot run, we cannot hide, we cannot defend ourselves. And basically, we have to rely on other people, other organisms to survive. All right. Um, with that in mind, basically, if we cry as an infant and someone comes to help us, if we are scared and someone comes to our aid, if we're hungry and someone feeds us, if these things happen, then we will develop a sense of trust. That will become a core component of our personality, and it will tend to stay with us for the rest of our life. Now, Erikson would also say that if you turn around and find yourself in a situation where you are in need of help and no one is there, if you are scared and you're left alone, if you're hungry and no one feeds you, you will develop a sense of mistrust. And this is where I take this a little different. my professors taught this a little different than other professors, is that if this becomes a core part of your personality, you trust or you mistrust, that's going to stay with you for the rest of your life. It doesn't mean that you'll never trust anybody ever again. It just means that your knee-jerk reaction to a great many things um, is that you will mistrust until persuaded otherwise, or you will trust until persuaded otherwise. It becomes a foundation of who you are. From approximately age 18 months to 3 years of age, Erikson says we go through what's called autonomy versus shame and doubt. And one of the very big things during this age, according to Erikson, and he was sort of following the Freudian belief, is that all things considered, we are learning to be self sufficient. And Freud talks about the concept of the anal stage, potty training, one of the first true acts of self sufficiency. And believe it or not, Erikson's theory seems to follow that lead, autonomy versus shame and doubt. If we get reinforcement for being doing things on our own, okay, showing signs of autonomy, that it will become part of our core personality. If we turn around and get a negative reaction for trying to be autonomous and take care of ourselves, and that maybe I think one would argue, that you're not basically doing a good job of cleaning yourself up and going to the bathroom, getting dressed, you're going to be ashamed of yourself and doubtful. It does not mean that for the rest of your days you're going to be doubtful of your ability to go to the bathroom. It just means that becomes a core part of your personality. From approximately age 3 to 5, or some say age 3 to 6, we start to get to the point that we become very apt to take the initiative, right? That we'll turn around and take the initiative. We will try things. This is when kids will suddenly perk up and start talking to someone out of nowhere, or run in a direction to check out something or go play with things. It depends on how you respond to this. If a child turns and runs, I don't want to say runs off, but runs to a playground that is close by without running in the street, let's say, they take the initiative. All right. If we support that, then they'll be willing to do that. If a child starts to talk to another child or an adult, and we support that, that becomes a core part of their personality. If we, you know, yell at them, that's really not the best word. If we discipline them, if we react in a negative way to their wanting to go over and take the initiative and pet a dog or start talking to adults, you're not supposed to talk unless spoken to, then they're going to feel guilty for that desire. And Erikson would say that that becomes a core part of their personality. So this is one way of looking at the theory, the interpretation of the theory. This is the way I was brought up and trained, and I tend to agree with it. From age 6 to about age 12, and children go through a sense of industry versus inferiority. And one of the biggest core components of this time is that children turn around and they start going to school. And in the process of going to school, it's not always a question of grades. Well, it can be. It's a question of how we respond to their hard work. This is Erikson's take on things. If they are industrious, if they try, and we support that, they will develop a sense of industry, an industrious mindset to working at things. If we turn around and attack them, or we say negative things, or we don't support them, maybe that's the best phrase, then they're going to feel a sense of inferiority, and basically that becomes a part of their foundation. So at each of these stages so far, you are developing, you can go one way or another. You can develop a foundation of trust or mistrust, a foundation of being self-sufficient or being ashamed because you tried that and got a negative reaction, of taking the initiative or feeling guilty for having done so, being industrious or feeling a sense of inferiority. So at each of these levels, one can go through these different stages. Finally, according to the fifth stage, identity versus role confusion, the premise here is that you're turning around and basically getting to the teen years. And now it's time to develop a sense of who you are. And a sense of who you are is a combination of really two things. Once again, this is how it was taught to me. Okay, different theorists, different ideas. Your identity is a combination of two things. First of all, your identity is a combination of those prior four stages. Who you are is a mix of if you're trusting or mistrusting, autonomous or ashamed, one to take the initiative or guilty. How that all comes together, industrious versus inferior, how that all comes together says something about your identity up to this point. And the second part of this theory is how do you handle this going from this step forward? Okay, during the teenage years, you're trying to figure out a lot of who you are, and we'll talk about diffusion and moratorium and things like that a little bit later. So, according to Erik Erikson, if you got to the end of your adolescent years, if you got to adulthood and you knew what you wanted, you were one for, you had identity. You knew your purpose and you knew your goal. If you got to the end of your years, adolescent years, and you still didn't know what you wanted to do, he referred to that as role confusion. Now you have to understand, Erikson basically grew up in a time where you didn't get to age 20 and find yourself going, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. That was pretty much determined. You were going into the workforce, you were going into schooling, further schooling, and that was really about your only choices. Okay, there wasn't many other choices to do. So today we don't always say that it's role confusion if you reach 20 and don't know. It's not seen as the end of the world. All right, these are the stages of Erikson I want you to know. I'm not done yet, but I wanted to point those out. And I know that is slightly different than some other books and theorists, but I go with my professors of past, and this is how they perceived it, and I'm going to stand by them. Another theory of self really relates to the following: role models, identification, and role models. Okay, so one of the things you got to ask yourself are, who are today's role models? I actually went to the trouble of trying to look up some websites and ask who they thought were today's role models. Now, some of these lists are from a few years ago. They may have changed, but let me share with you what they think. And you may, if you want to stop this for just a second and ask yourself, who are today's role models? Who are the best role models for children and teenagers today? By all means, please do so. Okay? Who are the worst ones? Think it over. Take a minute and give it some thought. And then when you think you've thought of some for the three best and the three worst, let's see if you match up with what we've got listed here. Okay? So give yourself a second or two or three. If nothing else, pause this lecture, and then we'll start here in just a moment. All right? When you're ready, just hit play and we'll continue. All right, are you ready? Well, if you've thought of some of the role models, the best role models for today, here is from a listing that I had found on the internet. And we all know that you can't put anything on the internet unless it's true, right? Jennifer Lawrence, she was from the Hunger Games and other movies and things like that. Taylor Swift, all right, the musician. I was surprised by this list. She is quite the role model, I guess, to some girls, or has been in the past. I don't know if you'd agree with it or not. I'm just going with the list I found. And Justin Timberlake, who's also been an entertainer and a singer, and usually has a pretty clean cut image compared to some of the others. All right. Michelle Obama was in there. There was other lists in there as well. I just wanted to share that. Some of the worst was the Kardashians. They said that they are definitely not the epitome of this whole list. Miley Cyrus. I remember my children watching her when she was on Disney, and then just say a transformation occurred. And then Kanye West, okay, which basically some of the lyrics and some of the behaviors have left people wondering. So here are some of today's role models. And this ties well into the work of a man by the name of Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura believed that when it comes to personality, okay, our theory of self, your personal identity results from watching others. And by watching others, as children and teens, we're talking identification. More specifically, he called this social learning theory. All right? Social learning theory is the key to children developing a sense of self. There's no unconscious forces, none of that. It's all about identification. Who do you identify with? Now, we could add other people to the list, more names to that list. That's by no means the whole list by any means. But the idea behind identification is that who you identify with results from who you watch, okay? Who you imitate, who is your role model. And that has a tremendous influence on how you develop. For what little it's worth, Albert Bandura is still with us. He is still alive and well today, professor at Stanford University. I believe he's retired, but he was the gentleman who came up with these theories. So what are we talking about here? It's all about who you identify with. Albert Bandura says there are 4 steps to identification, all right, and what children do. Step number 1 is that children decide who they want to be like, okay? What person do they identify with? I know during the years that we have the Olympics, sometimes the Summer Olympics more than the Winter Olympics, you hear of children doing that kind of stuff. Who do children want to dress up as during Halloween is a good example of that as well. Are they superheroes? Are they a princess? Are they some other character and so on? That says a lot about who they identify or want to be like. Next, children, once they've determined who they want to be like, they begin to act like that particular person, okay? Real or fictitious, they start to carry on as that person carries on. So they change their behavior. Next, they start to focus on their feelings, okay? They start to feel what the role model feels. If the role model is humble, then they may be humble. If they're arrogant, then they may be arrogant. If they are indignant towards other people, um, it can be the same way. Um, they sort of feel what the role model feels. And then ultimately, a lot of times they believe they are like that individual, okay? That they have achieved that and they are like that individual. So it's a very simple identification theory of how you develop a sense of self, but role models are a very powerful thing. And parents can be role models. um, you can have you can have bad people that are role models, and stuff like that. So I want to be a little careful there and not offend, but good people, bad people, people close to us, historical figures, they all have the potential to do that. All right, folks, that's enough for now. Okay, take care.